Pratt, I'm one of the historians in Strategic Defence Studies Centre and the convener of the War Studies seminar series. Tonight we have Lieutenant Colonel Richard Taylor joining us, who I've known for many, many years now, who is currently at the end of a long career in the New Zealand Army, many in varied postings. And this posting that he's in now is with the New Zealand War Studies Centre. So part of the New Zealand Army that looks at the New Zealand Defence Force that looks at the history of the New Zealand wars and also looks how to use them as a means of professional development in the New Zealand Defence Force, inculcating a sense of shared culture, etc., running battlefield tours and staff rides, which will tell you much more about his organisation and how it works and how it navigates the history of the New Zealand wars. Obviously, within the New Zealand military, there's people whose ancestry goes back to both sides of that conflict. So without further ado, Richard.
Thank you very much, Garth. And thanks everyone for coming tonight. Very kind words there to start with, Garth. We have known each other for a long time, actually. You're talking about that before. So yeah, I really welcome the opportunity to come and speak to you today and to share some of what we do at the New Zealand War Studies Centre with this group, and I see a couple online as well. Just to perhaps by way of background, so I'm in I guess my core in the New Zealand Army. I'm an educator. I was an infantry officer in our reserves before I joined. I was brought in for 3 months at the end of 1986 to do one job at the Army Museum, and I haven't found the outdoor yet, so I'm still here. I've had a long-standing interest, though, in the New Zealand wars. I grew up in the South Waikato, part of the North Island, south of Auckland, a very short distance from where the largest of the New Zealand wars campaigns was fought. So I sort of grew up with a bit of an interest in what had happened there. The time I was growing up, there was very little written about it, and the reality is very little interest in it. It's just something that happened years and years ago. They were still referred to as the Maori Wars or the Land Wars, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. But I did a paper on it when I was at university in 1985. Subsequently got involved in running battlefield tours for New Zealand Army personnel when I went into the regular force. So that was late 80s and early 90s, and eventually did a PhD looking at British logistics in the New Zealand wars, which was actually a lot more interesting than it sounds. So it sort of I used that topic to sort of look at all the previous interpretations of the wars, and really none of them had taken logistical aspects into account really significantly. So it's a way of examining and in some cases challenging some of those previous accounts. So sort of come to it with now looking back at sort of 40 years of real deep interest in research and teaching. So I feel very privileged to have the position that I now hold. Perhaps if I could this isn't a test, but I just thought I might start with a question, if I could. Well, about that. No. Well, I was going to ask you, while we're fixing it up, could I just ask this group here, when we talk about the New Zealand wars, could I just ask, what does that mean to you? Yeah, given that, as we'll see later on, there was actually an Australian dimension to our wars, but any thoughts, anyone?
Well, I knew that there were a large number of militia we know, but also the Victorian Navy.
Yes.
About those sorts of things.
Yeah,
I'm here.
Yes.
So it's interesting. I mean, when I was at primary school as well, I mean, they were taught as the Maori Wars.
Yes.
Or as, and then they became replaced with the Land Wars.
Yeah.
So that's my.
Yeah.
We sort of. I mean, the change in syntax, grammar and syntax language, I think is important.
Yeah.
But that's how it was taught at at primary school. And it was taught very much, I think, still very much in a one-sided way.
That's true. Yeah,
It was,
almost hands off.
yes,
As it happened, and
yes,
all you need to know is they happened.
yes. So it's very much about history disconnected from what might have been happening in a contemporary sense, even mostly they went was at primary school.
Okay, thank you. Yep. So
which has John and everything else.
yeah, okay. No, so what I'm going to do tonight, we're sort of pre-born here as I'm talking about. So just sort of, if you like, a very brief overview of the New Zealand Wars to explain what we mean by it, and that will then provide context to my final comments later on. Then I'll talk about what my centre does, and then I'll finish talking about some of the challenges we have in our defence force, because we have large, significant numbers of our personnel are descended from people who fought on either side, and in some cases, actually, people who fought on both sides as well.
Yep.
So yet another dimension. So just with that question there, there's almost two components. There's the New Zealand bit, and as was mentioned earlier, we used to refer to them. They were initially called the Maori Wars, and that wasn't intended to imply any form of blame on the Māori or anything like that. It just reflected the British practice of naming their wars after their opponents. So you have the Boer War, you have the Maori War, you have the Afghan War, its wars, etc. And that's where that came from. Subsequently, the term land wars came into general use. The problem with that is that most of the wars weren't actually fought over land at all. There were other issues. A number of the campaigns resulted in lands being lost or confiscated, or both. But there were a whole range of other factors that came into play. So that's sort of the New Zealand bit, if you're like part of the name. The second one, though, is the word wars, plural. So we had two major periods of conflict in the 1840s, 45 to 48, and then again from 1860 to 72. But the thing to note with those, this work really go. The thing to note with it is that each of the wars was a distinct war in its own right. They were fought between the different groups of adversaries in different locations at different times and over different issues. Does that make sense? So it wasn't like the Pākehā or the white people, the settlers versus the Māori for a full extended period of time. But that each of the wars had its own very complex causes and effects, and they're not necessarily they can't necessarily be seen in very black and white terms. That part of our job then at the New Zealand Wars Study Centre was to try to break through that complexity, but do it in a way that makes it easy for people to understand and get the main points out of it, without, of course, at the same time oversimplifying what happened. I guess that's very much the role of the historian. That's really what we want to do. So does that sort of explain that bit? Yeah. So looking then just very quickly a chronological overview. As with any other period of conflict, of course, these wars need to be we need to explain them in terms of the context in which they occurred. So I talked before about the first period of war as being 1845 to 47-48. Prior to that, though, in 1840 we had our Treaty of Waitangi, a treaty between the British Crown and a large number, but not all, of the Māori chiefs. Prior to that, though, from about 1807 through to 1840, there was a period of what we now call the Musket Wars. So they were wars fought between the various Māori tribes themselves. Basically, what happened was a couple of the one point I should note is the Māori people, although we just use the term Māori generically, they were very much a tribally based people. So right throughout the period of the wars, they saw themselves as they related to their tribes rather than to their race. Does that make sense? And it's a really important point to make. So these musket wars were fought very much between tribes. Basically, what happened, without going into too much detail, a couple of Ngāpui chiefs, two chiefs from the top of the North Island of New Zealand, visited the UK, actually met with the British King. He presented them with 2 suits of armour from the Tower of London, and on their way back to New Zealand, they traded the 2 suits of armour for 200 muskets. You probably know where this is going. Bought the muskets back to New Zealand. Initially, fought almost a civil war within their own tribe. So it was these 2 chiefs, if you like, were, guess you could say, removing potential rivals. They then launched a series of raids further south into the North Island as well. That resulted in a significant dislocation. So tribes, iwi, were quite literally forced from the middle of the North Island all the way down to the bottom of the North Island, where Wellington now is. The tribe that was in Wellington was pushed, they themselves were pushed over to the South Island. To give some idea of the scale, it's thought that at the start of the musket wars, the Māori population would have been about 200,000, and it's estimated that around about 60,000 people were killed during the musket wars. Okay, so huge losses. By contrast, the period of what we call the New Zealand Wars, about 2,000 Māori were killed. Now, I don't say that to justify or to somehow make the New Zealand Wars seem less bad, because of course they weren't, and they continue to the effects of the New Zealand Wars continue to play out in our society today. But the musket wars then they were one of the driving factors for the Treaty of Waitangi itself. So the numbers of chiefs thought, that there's got to be a better way for us. We've got to find some sort of system of law and governance in our country that will stop this fighting. Another point that I should make is a term called utu, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with. So utu is a Māori word, which basically means it means sort of balance or compensation, if you like. Some people see it as meaning revenge. It doesn't necessarily mean something bad. It's sort of, it's treating others as you would expect to be treated, basically. So if you've been treated well by someone, you respond by treating them well. Of course, if they have fought against you, then, at some time in the future, you may well look for an opportunity to get even. And we see during the New Zealand Wars, that played out on a number of occasions. So a number of Māori tribes sided with the Crown, basically. Initially the British government and subsequently the colonial government. Does that make sense? It probably doesn't make sense, but probably the most surprising aspect of the New Zealand Wars is that more Māori actually fought on behalf of the Crown than against it. Okay, again, that normally, it just doesn't make sense to people when you say that, but that is the case. So, again, I want to emphasise it wasn't a case of, all Māori versus against the Crown. It was far from it. There were a number of tribes, a number of big tribes fought against the Crown, but as we'll see later on, others, for their own reasons, actually chose to side with the Crown. Okay? And that's sort of something that, people find that really surprising when that's pointed out. But there's still a sense in New Zealand that it was very much the Māori people versus the British Crown. So the first wars were in the 1840s in 3 different locations. Over the period of 1852 to 56, New Zealand got self-government. So we had a constitution granted. It basically allowed our colonial government, Auckland is the capital of that port, so the colonial government to be responsible for the internal affairs of New Zealand, and the governor, the Queen's representative, would be responsible for 2 things. One was the relationship with the government the British government back in the UK, and the other one was what we might now call Māori affairs. At the time it was called Native Affairs. So he was responsible for acting as, if you like, the Queen's guarantor for the policies that were made in the Treaty of Waitangi. Does that make sense? So you've suddenly got a situation there where, in the 1840s, the governors ruled as law. The 1850s, the European population was expanding very quickly. 1858, the European population actually overtook the Maori population. It was a huge increase. Went from 2,000 Europeans in New Zealand in 1840 when the treaty was signed. By 1858, it was up to about 100,000. So a huge increase in population. Okay. But you've then got, so without, at that point, then you've got a colonial government with a rapidly growing European population who come to New Zealand thinking that they're going to get access to land and other resources and be able to set up businesses and farms, but that land wasn't available. And so that set off these series of wars in the 1860s, some of which were fought over the issue of land. There were, so the second period of conflict then was 1860 to 72. I've mentioned down the bottom there's three other, we can call them incidents if you like, three other significant events, which some people have seen as being part of the New Zealand Wars. So traditionally we've said that the New Zealand Wars finished in February 1872. In 1881 there's a small village in Taranaki on the west coast of the North Island, a village called Tarihaka, where what had happened was there was a pacifist movement, if you like, that had reoccupied a small section of confiscated land and re-established a village there. And so what they wanted to do was essentially live there. It was a peaceful protest against the government, but what they were hoping to do was to be allowed to live there peacefully, with the hope that the government would say, well, okay, you can stay there. And it was sort of seen as a peaceful counter to the whole process of confiscation. The government wasn't having it, so sent a force of armed constabulary in to clear the village out, and the leaders were arrested and imprisoned for periods of up to 2 years. The second one, the dog tax war, was you have dog taxes in Australia with your dog registration fees? New Zealand, they were introduced in New Zealand and Northland in 1898. A local council decided to impose a dog tax as a way of raising revenue for itself. Most of the people who lived in the area were Māori, and most of the dogs in the area were owned by Māori. So the tax fell very heavily on the Māori people themselves. I don't think that was intended, but that was effectively what happened. So again, a number of Māori armed themselves and threatened to fight, to literally take up arms against the council. Again, police were called in. The local MP, the local Māori MP, got involved and sort of talked his way through to a resolution. And we still have dog taxes in New Zealand. And finally, Mongapahatu was an incident during the First World War. A Māori prophet, a man called Rua Kanana, set up again a village in the central North Island. He preached, again, he argued against conscription. We had conscription during the First World War, but not for Māori. So he was arguing against conscription and indeed against the First World War. So he was arrested and charged, and in fact imprisoned for sedition. Did about 5 years in prison. So that some people have seen those as, if you like, the final episodes of the New Zealand Wars. Okay, so just looking at the wars themselves, and I'm not going to go into any detail with these, but essentially there's, if you like, there's three major conflicts. These are, three major periods of conflict, rather. So if you know the North, they all took place on the North Island of New Zealand. Right. So if you know the geography of New Zealand, you sort of get a sense of where these were fought. So in the 1840s, the wars were primarily between British troops and the Royal Navy, and a number of Māori allies against other Māori. Over the period 1860 to 66, we start to see greater involvement by colonial troops and Māori allies as well. So, significant numbers of formations of Māori troops being raised and on serving. And that was the period where a couple of thousand volunteers came over from Australia and joined the Waikato militia. So the biggest and the decisive campaign of the New Zealand Wars was the Waikato War in 1863 to 64. It was estimated that the war would cost over £1 million. The country was almost broke at that point. The British government said that they would not be prepared to fund the cost of the campaign. So if there was to be invasion of the Waikato, the colonial government would have to pay for it. So the plan was to raise a force of about 4,000 Waikato militia, 4 regiments of 1,000 each. They would fight in the war, and then at the end of the war, they would be given grants of confiscated land. A private soldier would get 50 acres. I think a lieutenant colonel got 400. So they can work that out. And so they'd get sort of that much farmland, and they'd also get an acre of land in town as well. So they could have a property, or they could sell part of that land in town as a way of raising money. So a couple of thousand Australians signed up for that force and went on to fight in the New Zealand Wars. And the final period, 1867 to 72, after the adoption of the self-reliant policy, the fighting was conducted entirely by colonial troops and Māori allies. Okay. Those wars there. I won't go into it in detail, but suffice it to say that there's although these wars were fought in different places at different times, there are a number of linkages between them, and we see a number of cases of a war, and the Wellington War led on to the Whanganui War. A minor chief from Whanganui was taken prisoner of war in the Wellington War. Because Wellington was under martial law at the time, he was charged with mutiny and was executed. And so as Utu for that, I talked about Utu earlier, his chief attacked the European settlement in Whanganui, and that became the Whanganui War. So there's all these linkages, if you like. So then very quickly, who fought in the New Zealand Wars? So obviously on one side there were the Māori who were opposing the Crown and the colonial government. The other side, the imperial forces, so the Army and the Royal Navy, the local settler volunteer forces, and I include in that the troops who came from Australia, and then finally the Māori allies, or the term that was used then and is still used as Papa, which has a number of meanings, some of them complementary and others not so. Something I would note is that some Māori actually fought on different sides at different times. Okay, during the Wellington War, the tribe, the Te Atiawa tribe, who originally came from New Plymouth, fought on the British side. After the war, they were Governor Grey allowed them. They asked to be able to go back to their tribal lands in Taranaki around New Plymouth. Governor Grey allowed them to do that, and of course they got there and found that all of their land had been sold to settlers by people who had no right to sell the land. So that led to the First Taranaki War. So they fought on the government side in the Wellington War and then against it in the First Taranaki War. Okay. Are there any questions so far? So that's just to give you a sort of a contextual overview, if you like, of the New Zealand Wars without going into too much detail. So if I could turn now then to the issue. Oh, please.
Was it correct? I've just been in Australia. Those gadgets look pretty special.
Yes.
Who was advising training with the army?
They did it themselves. Yeah, they were very, very capable field engineers and very adaptable. So their earliest experience of artillery, 30, 40 years prior to the treaty, soon after that, the first European settlers of New Zealand were whalers and sailors, and numbers of Māori would actually work on whale boats. And so in those days, of course, ships all carry cannon, carry a couple of cannon for signalling purposes or counter piracy. So those Māori got to see artillery pieces and learned how to fire them, etc. And very quickly worked out, they were able to work out what these things could potentially do to traditional Māori defences as well. So during the Northern War in 1845, the first of the set-piece battles, if you like, the Māori, their traditional fortification was called a pā, Q-A. Prior to the coming of the musket and artillery, they tended to be built on the top of hills and strategic points. With the coming of artillery and the musket, they worked out very quickly that being on top of the hill could actually be a death trap. What they would do is go down, so they'd look for flat ground, dig trenches. They overhead protection, so they logs with wood over the top. They developed it all themselves. When the British, and the first series of attacks against these pās were repulsed with very heavy casualties for the British. What the Māori would tend to do was they'd build the pā in an expendable location. They would fight the battle, repulse the British attack, and then go away somewhere else and build a new pā. They didn't necessarily build the pā on a site that they particularly wanted to hold. Does that make sense? So the pā was a way of causing attrition. Sorry, this is a long answer to your question. So what it meant was that after these battles, the British would be defeated, but would still capture an empty pā. And so very early on, it was suggested that maybe the Pākehā, the European missionaries, might be giving them advice. A number of the missionaries were former military officers. That was denied. It was suggested that we had Americans, had a small American diaspora in New Zealand at the time. It was suggested that maybe they were given advice. But it was one of the missionaries from the Bay of Islands reported in his diary that he saw them. They developed these positions without any assistance whatsoever, any advice from Europeans. So just worked it out themselves. And they were they're the sort of things they're an early version of what we saw on the Western Front in World War I. So the palisading and apparently weakened points so that an attacking force would be channeled into a killing ground, etc. Double lines of trenches, etc. They did it all themselves.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
So what the type thing about it when like they once in Tolkien, they were one of the veterans, Americans, Brits, who went in sort of after his mercenary advice.
Yeah.
And you walk into that.
Yes.
You found nothing.
That nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's they were, as I say, they were very, very capable field engineers, no doubt about that whatsoever. Sorry.
I just see what excellent that. New Zealand Māori had a long 3-settlement history of the conflict. They were all beaten, well known, and we talked before, Pākehā, right before the Roman settlement, they were all beaten and well known as fighters, if you like. That's what leads into, for example, the whole Māori Italian context. But it's also interesting, to think about the broader political context in which this is happening, because you made a very passing reference to the local Māori MP. The Māori seats were established, I think, in the late 1880s?
Yeah, it was about 1867 and 68, yeah.
Okay, so earlier than I remember. Yes, I've done anything on that. Okay, so it's really interesting to see that there is this much broader political context as well. So you say the 4 Māori seats established, partly because of the issue of taxation without representation. There were mining seats. I think there were special mining seats.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons. So that it was quite complex, so that it's not just simply, it's not that with those relationships are actually quite complex even outside that situation of conflict as well. And it's really interesting to think about role that Māori MP have took then and also continue to.
Understand.
Yeah.
After the first really heavy defeat the British suffered was at a Highway, basically the Highway and then the North Bay of Islands. An attacking force at about 200, a storming party of about 200, 110 were killed or wounded. And the Māori inside the pa, they'd got an old ship's cannon, and they put a famous story, a bullet chain. They'd stuffed the cannon with a bullet chain, had a whole lot of gunpowder and stones and rocks, and you of course fired it. But it literally sides down the attacking troops are fired on the flank. Yeah. Within about 3 weeks of that battle, there were small matchsticks, but maybe about that size, matchstick models of that pa were being circulated around the various tribes in the North Island. So that, so the defenders of our Highway, they set these things out saying this is what we developed, and it was. They appeared about 3 weeks later. They were, the Māori tribes in Wellington had examples of it. Yeah, so it's something that has been looked into. The whole point of, did they get outside assistance? But there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that happened. So just turning now to the New Zealand War Study Centre. Then the centre itself was established in 2013, but it actually its roots go back a lot further. So in the late 1980s, early 1990s, we used to have a system whereby all regular force officers had to do a course in military history and a course in international relations to go to the rank of major. So that when we do it at about the captain level. And what used to happen was a regional education officer was tasked with putting together a reading program. What was decided, though, in the late 1980s, that rather than doing it in-house, we would buy in a number of university papers from the University of Waikato, so an undergraduate international relations paper and an undergraduate paper which just happened to be the New Zealand Wars. So as part of that, we started running battlefield tours to each year's group of students. We're doing it. So we went through a period from about 1989 through to the late 1990s, where basically every regular force officer, went through these battlefield tours. For a number of reasons, we stopped doing that in the late 90s. We bought into another academic program at another university and just let them just simply stop doing it. But in 2013, the Army component commander, Brigadier Mark Wheeler, who was one of the first students to do the battle site tours, who came out with the idea. He'd done a lot of his training in the United States and remembered how the Americans used the battlefields of the American Civil War as a really important learning tool. So he thought, we should be doing the same with our war. So he basically sponsored, if you will, the establishment of the New Zealand War Study Centre. In 2023, it was formally transferred to the New Zealand Defence College as a subunit of the Command and Staff College. That will likely change very shortly, and it will be its own standalone thing. Very small unit, so just one regular force director, myself, and a number of reserve officers who all have a degree of, no pun intended, a degree of expertise in the New Zealand Wars. Okay, so very much, fair to say it's sort of run on the smell of an oily rag, but it actually suits the way that we do it. So what happens is a unit or a course, if they want to include some of our work, aspects of our work in their programs, they approach us and we work with them to see how it happens. So, a tactics course, for example, we can visit a battlefield and give a presentation on defensive operations and draw out the lessons that's still applicable. The same as what the Australian Army does today.
No civilians.
So no civilian staff, or
no civilian staff.
No, but that may not always be the case. Yeah, that may not always be the case. there was a period when it was suggested that maybe the director's position could be civilianised, but the decision was made to keep the director in uniform, because we wanted to make sure that the individual, we careful how I say this, that the individual had some background in military operational planning and that sort of thing. And it's the academic community even today in New Zealand that focuses on the New Zealand wars. There are very few non-uniform ones who have that background. Yeah.
Are there any plans to open up tours to the public?
No. It is partly no. In short, no. Yeah. In short, no. There's it's the focus of what we do is on the NZDF. It includes civilians as well, though. Should know. Yeah. Sorry.
How many of you are obviously involved in this main activity?
Sorry.
And how many married?
I have some Māori heritage. The other two don't, but I think I'm more than confident that we, as part of our research, we look at very closely at both sides, and we look at we take into account the iwi accounts, and there are some very good accounts. With our battlefield tours, we engage with the local iwi to get their perspective. So yeah, we do make sure that as best we can, that is taken into account. Yeah, but that's a good question. That is a fair question.
What do the battle sites look like now? And I'm just thinking about if I think about the Bay of Fiji, for example.
Yeah, unfortunately,
So, what would have been a battle site then? It's now a suburb.
Some of them, there are still note signs, as entrenchments and that sort of thing. So if you know what to look for and you know where to go, you can find them. Unfortunately, we haven't been very good with a lot of them. We've got main roads through some of our most important battlefields. But there is now more work. There's over about the past 10 to 15 years, there's sort of a growing recognition at government level that more needs to be done. So there is a lot of work being done to, restore's probably the wrong word, but to improve access to the battlefields and to protect them. Taranaki, for example, I was there. Sorry, you from New Zealand?
I'm of the other generation. I went to school. I was going through school when it was the New Zealand Wars.
Yeah.
We did these field trips up to Taranaki. Taranaki is the best preserved sites.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So there are,
You can still visit Waikato, for example.
Yeah, I mean, it was raised to the ground, but some of the past sites up there
are still there. Yeah. No, you're quite right. So, but what's now happened? So some of the ones that you would have visited, they're now putting in, improved access, setting aside separate parking areas so that tour groups can go in, much better interpretive panels up. So previously it's just a sign saying, Mahau Tahi. And if you don't know what Mahau Tahi is or was, then you've got no idea. Whereas you can go there now, it's a very important battle, and this is what happened, and this is how it fitted into the first.
So is that working with, archaeologists?
Yeah, it's archaeologists, the local iwi, historians such as ourselves. Yeah, it's being really well done. It's actually quite exciting to see about that. Yeah.
Is the lining national park, ground land, what?
Some of them are Crown land. Some of the battlefields are on Crown land. Others are on private land. But again, and almost invariably farmland. But the landowners, if you like, have generally proved more than willing to have the access. So what they'll say, I think that the landowner will get it, that the site is of value. So essentially it's a partnership between, if you like, the local council and the iwi and the landowner himself or herself or themselves. Whereby, and I'm thinking of one, Puketa Kaueri in New Plymouth, so it's east of New Plymouth. To me, I rate that as the greatest Māori victory of the New Zealand Wars. It's an outstanding defensive, tactical defensive battle. It's quite outstanding. Now the position is off the road, so to get to it, we've got to walk through farmland. And so what the farmer is, they basically come to an agreement between them. There is a fenced walking track, which is actually wide enough for a vehicle to go to drive onto the site. So if there's someone who has mobility issues, for example, we get very, very close to the position. The council essentially pays much. There would be a funding arrangement with the farmer, because effectively the farmer's lost a little bit of farmland, but there's a funding arrangement to compensate for that. Maybe it's a reduction in rates or something, but the council pays for that land to be sort of kept mowed, so that so it's not. I think the farmer does it, and the council pays the farmer to do it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the farmer will get the mower on the back of the tractor, and will mow this. It's probably about a 400 to 500 meter belt, and sort of maybe 5 or 6 meters wide. So it's just a couple of sweeps with a mower, and it's done. The job's done. So there's sort of. I can't think of any sites where someone has said, no, I'm not prepared to allow you. I'm not prepared to let you get on.
That one you were just describing there, Plymouth.
Yes.
Is that the one where the British dug that through?
So, no, that was a later one. A later, if you done your order, yeah, or TRI, yeah. But at so I don't want to set me off if you're not careful. So at Puketakaueri, it was a if you could imagine two pā. You know what we mean? We talk about the saddle of a hill. So you got two bits of high ground and sort of a saddle between them. So there were two pā, probably about 150 meters apart, built on the two high points, and they were surrounded by swamp and a whole lot of ravines and that. The British, they built the pā in plain view of the British, so the British were observing from about 1,500 meters away, but from where the British position was, they couldn't see the ravines. They could just see the high ground, where this is going. So when the British attacked, they had this really complicated scheme of manoeuvre with cut-off groups and everything else. And as it turned out, there were virtually no Māori warriors in the two parts. They were actually deployed in hidden trenches and fire pits along the approach routes. So as the British forces were moving into what we call reforming up places for the assault on the pā, they themselves came under fire and had no way of countering it, because their plan had been to all up and attack the pā, for the two parts. Yeah, so force of 350, 20% of them were killed or wounded. Yeah, it was a brilliant example of use of land in defence.
What year was that?
1816, 27th of June 1860. Sorry, once I start talking, I apologise. So the aims are. Oh, sorry. Just look at the aims now, and the logically should be fairly obvious. But so first of all, to use the battles and campaigns of the New Zealand Wars to teach the to use those battles and campaigns to sort of teach military personnel about the nature and characteristics of warfare. And, rather than having a lecture on what we mean by defence, you can actually take soldiers out and show them the layout of the position and how land can be used and terrain can be used to develop a defensive position. We use it to contribute basically to overall professional military development of our personnel, so that any number of other courses that our people do, it might be in leadership, it might be in logistics, it might be in look, pretty much anything, race relations, cultural awareness, those sorts of things, important for peacekeeping missions, etc. We can use these campaigns to draw out those lessons, and also to, if you like, to enhance organisational capabilities, so that and individual citizenship development. So yes, these people are all New Zealand soldiers, sailors, airmen. They're also New Zealand citizens, and so we see it as important to help give them a better understanding of the development of New Zealand as a country, and the part that these wars played in the development of that country. Okay, so there's not, in the past we would have, for a tactics course, those students would have to write an essay about a battle, and they might do Stalingrad, or they might do Waterloo, or they might do Antietam or something. It's all well and good, but what increasingly now they will choose a battle from the New Zealand wars and really get into it. And we find that they genuinely tend to enjoy it as well. You know, it's almost like their eyes are open at people that had this experience. Some of the themes that we can cover. So while we talk about battlefield tours and staff rides, what we can do is we can hone in on a particular aspect. So, you know, for example, if we're teaching joint operational planning, we can use the Waikato War as a really good example of a joint campaign and, you know, how joint effects are applied. And we can talk about the principles of operational planning or joint operational planning, etc. Coalition warfare is another interesting one. I talked earlier about the different iwi that sided with the British for their own reasons. So one of the last campaigns of the New Zealand Wars, the last big campaigns, was in 1869. The pursuit of a chief called Te Kooti through the central North Island. The government force that was arraigned against him, if you like, included about 500 stores. So it wasn't a big force, but it included a company of armed constabulary who were a mixed Māori Pākehā unit, had all sorts of people in them, and 3 distinct tribal groups. And each of those tribal groups had their own reason for going after Te Kooti. Does that make sense? So, and each had a different reason for wanting to get the stone. So it wasn't like, yeah, we're going to sign up to a big plan and we're all one. They each had their own reason for doing it. So, so what that meant for the force commander, a Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McDonnell, he had to. He didn't have a single united force, if you like. He basically had 4 elements that he had to work just as a commander would have to do now in an international coalition operation. So, you know, I use the example, the New Zealand contingent commanders and the battalion commanders in Timor, they'd have a company of soldiers from Singapore, or they might have a company of Gurkhas, and they might have a platoon of Fijians, etc. So you've got all these different groups that are part of that force for political and other reasons. And so the contingent commander has to be very careful and sort of, you know, understanding their motivations and making sure that they, how would I put it, that they either they aren't exposed to too much risk or to too little risk. Does that make sense? Yeah. So with the battle with the final battle against Te Kooti in October 1869, one of the problems McDonnell had was he had to make sure that all 3 Māori contingents and the armed constabulary had to be seen to be playing an equal part of the battle. But normally there would be a force would have been sent to the rear of the player as a cut-off force. He couldn't actually afford to do that, because if he did that and that force didn't come into contact with Te Kooti, then it would be seen as if they had been, it would be seen by them as an affront to their own prestige, the Māori word is mana. So it would have been, you know, so they all had to be seen to be playing an equally important role. So we could use that as an example of coalition warfare. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Can I just ask again?
Yeah.
Access comes under leadership, but I noticed that, and the example you've just given, it seems points very much the conflict of diplomacy and negotiation, but it's not explicitly stated there as one of your themes. Did that just come under leadership? Or
it would come under command of leadership and coalition warfare. Yeah. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. So yeah, the tours themselves pretty much reflect what you saw earlier. The map that you see, that's an old map from about 1922, and still actually a very good history of the New Zealand Wars. The red dots just show the location of major military bases. All right, so it gives you an idea of where people are in relation to the battlefield tours that we run. there was only one incident in the South Island, something called the Wairau Affray, which was a clash between a group of settlers and the Māori tribe. 23 of the settlers were killed. But that's not seen as part of the New Zealand Wars. It's actually near Glenham, Woodburn Air Force Base in Glenham. Okay, our approach. So this is what we sort of have signed up to do, and as best we can hold each other accountable for. So we sort of got three central philosophical approaches, if you like. First is respect. We accept the fact, that and then we point this out right at the start of the tours, is that the participants in the tours could well have ancestors who fought on either side. And with intermarriage, and I know of a number of cases, we will have, soldiers who might identify as Māori, who will also have an ancestor there who fought on the British side. Does that make sense? So there's that dynamic there. So it's a matter of not playing up one side against each other, accepting, that you're basically talking about a number of different groups of combatants, and this was their experience during the period of the New Zealand Wars. Non-judgmental. What we mean by that is that there are a number of while we use the wars to try to bring out modern lessons or lessons about the nature of warfare, what we don't try to we try to avoid doing, and we won't deliberately do, is try to apply modern day judgments to what happened in those wars. So there were certain things that happened during the wars. I'll give you an example in a moment, where people look at it today and think, well, that's why would you do that? That's crazy. But no, it reflects the time. So actually two incidents. One was I talked about the Northern War before, where the Māori built their first pa that we talked about. The one of the two leaders of the what was seen as a rebellion, fighting against the British, a man called Honaheki, a Christian, was during a battle amongst the Māori themselves, with no British involved, was shot through the thigh, very badly wounded. It was thought he would, shot in the abdomen, it was thought he would die. He was taken to the mission station right in the middle of the theatre of operations, a place called Waimati or Waimati North, and was nursed back to health by the missionaries. And as a result of that, he made a pledge that he would not damage any church, he would not damage or attack any church property at all during the war against the British. What that meant, of course, was virtually all of the infrastructure in the theatre of war was church property. So the roads had been developed, the roads that were used by the British to move artillery and supplies had been established to support the mission stations. So, he although he was pressured by his ally, a man called Kawati, to conduct ambushing, and in one of these roads he refused to do it. He said, no, I've given my word that I will not attack church property, and those roads are church property. Yeah, there was another case, the First Taranaki War, so that was 1860 to 61. During the Musket Wars, the Waikato war parties from the Waikato had come and attacked the Te Atiawa tribe near Plymouth at Waitara. Inflicted very heavy casualties, to the extent that Te Atiawa abandoned their tribal homelands and went south to Wellington and subsequently returned. So when fast forwarding to 30 years to the First Taranaki War, a war party from the Waikato came down to help to support the Te Atiawa. The place called Mahauitahi. They met. Their leaders met with the Te Atiawa leaders. They hatched a plan that the Waikato contingent, about 130 of them, would establish positions on a low hill, a place called Mahauitahi, wait for the British to attack, and then the Te Atiawa would attack the British from a flank. So that was the plan that was agreed to. In the event, what happened was the British attacked and the Te Atiawa held back. and let the British run right over them. So the 130, something like 110 were killed or wounded. And what that was about was the Te Atiawa thought this, even though the Waikato had come down to help them, they looked at it and thought, no, this is revenge for what they did to us 30 years ago. It seems, now we'd say it's crazy, but that just reflected that was that system. That's how they saw it. Yeah. Okay. And the partiality. So we won't, we will make sure that we tell both sides of the story. We won't overplay one side or play that one side against the other. But we are, if clearly there's there's something that is worthy of praise, then we don't shy away from doing that. And I did that a few minutes ago with Property Power, for example. If there's something that's quite outstanding, it's entirely appropriate to acknowledge that. Okay, so some of the challenges, we're just about there. Some of the challenges that we face. The first one I talked about. Initially the centre was set up for the Army. We now provide the services right across the NZDF. Obviously, there was no air component at the time, and the Navy initially saw themselves as having no part in this. So our navies look back and see, no, that was the Royal Navy. That's not our history. They've now come around to it. The way we approach it is, we talk about maritime operations during the New Zealand Wars, rather than necessarily just the British. So we put a lot of work over the years, both with the programs themselves to make sure that they're relevant to non-army personnel and defence civilians, and also a bit of direct marketing as well. So if one of us is visiting a camp or a location, we'll seek an opportunity to talk to the senior staff and talk about our programs. And what we're finding, in fact, is that as more people do them, we get people approaching us saying, I heard, the next door to me did one of your tours. Could you do one for us as well? So it's sort of, that's picking up its own momentum. Ensuring that all side stories are told. I talked about that a moment ago. So that very much is a process of, looking at the records themselves. With the Māori people, of course, a lot of their records are oral. It's very much an oral tradition. So engaging with, people from within the different tribes who have a good sense of that history, and getting their stories as well. Occasionally things don't exactly equate. You can get dates will be wrong and the order that things have happened wrong, but then that's actually an opportunity to sort of talk it through with them anyway. And that way we all learn from each other, okay? Certain mythology around some aspects of the wars. So, frequently someone will say that, I heard that classic one is the Māori invented trench warfare is a common one that has crept in. And no, they didn't invent it. Other people were using trenches at the same time. The British encountered trenches in Burma in the 1830s, so they can encounter these sorts of things earlier. But it's just a way of you can without disparaging the mythology, because it's the fact that there is a myth is important in its own right, but it's just a way of sort of explaining it better and working through it. The musket wars, that brings its own challenge. So as I talked earlier, 60,000 dead during the musket wars, versus slightly under 2,000 Māori killed during the New Zealand Wars. So on the one hand, we need to explain the significance and the impact of the musket wars on the New Zealand Wars, but we need to do it in a way that doesn't make it look as if we're saying that the New Zealand Wars, look, they weren't that bad because all those people died over there. That's certainly not the message that we're saying. Linking the New Zealand Wars to the development of the character and warfighting ethos of the Army and the NZDF. But if we look at we've traditionally in New Zealand talk about our military traditions starting at Gallipoli. Occasionally people will talk about the wheel, but certainly when I grew up, it was all about Gallipoli. But if we look at the New Zealand Army, the things that, we're obviously a small army or a small defence force, the sort of things that we tend to do well at, small unit operations. We tend to work well in coalitions, tend to be sort of innovative, good defensively, etc. So a lot of those characteristics were actually developed during the New Zealand Wars, and there's clear evidence that particularly the colonial troops and Māori troops working very, very closely in the bush together. A lot of the Pākehā, the European troops, learned to speak Māori, became fluent in Māori. So there's a sense in New Zealand, something that we pride ourselves on, but I always say that we don't want to take it for granted, is our ability to work well with other cultures. And I think we see the genesis of that during these wars. And the final one, there's a Māori word, whakamā, which you know what whakamā, shame. Yeah. So so there is the Māori have a concept of whakamā, where shame or embarrassment about something that may not necessarily be your fault, but you still feel embarrassed or ashamed about it. So the troops, our personnel who are from a European background can sometimes feel ashamed of what happened, and you get Māori Māori personnel who are descended from tribes that supported the British can also feel a sense of shame. But it's a matter of explaining that we today need not, I myself personally was not responsible for the New Zealand War, so I'm happy to talk about it and to teach about it, but we can't. I think it's completely unreasonable for service personnel today to try to feel a sense of personal shame for what happened. We can regret it, but but we certainly don't seek to impose that on people. And finally, just some of the experiences. So generally very positive. Okay. We talked earlier about people growing up knowing nothing about the New Zealand Wars. There's now an element of the New Zealand Social Studies and History curriculum which looks at the New Zealand Wars, which is well overdue. But generally, people come along, and at the end of the tours or the staff rides, they'll say, I feel as though a gap has been filled. That I just felt there was something missing in my knowledge about our own history. And this has been part of the process. I had a personal experience about this time last year. I conducted a battlefield tour of the Waikato for a group of Navy personnel and civilians. One of them, he was ex-Navy, now a retired civilian, but still working for Navy. Sorry, a retired naval person, sailor who was working for Navy as a civilian. Sorry. He came to me at the first stop and said he was the great nephew of King Tawhiao, the second Māori king, who led the resistance to the invasion of Waikato. And I thought, oops, this could be dicey. And we got to the end of the tour, and I said, look, would you like to? I sort of wrapped up with my comments, and I always give people a chance. I said, look, without putting you on the spot, would you like to say something? And he said to me, I was actually personally touched. He said, I always grew up, I grew up with our stories of the wars and never understanding how these things could possibly happen. And now, having listened to you today and hearing about the background to the wars, I now have a much better understanding of it. And I realised that, yes, there's another side. That it doesn't mean that our side is wrong, but he said, I've now heard another side of it. And he said, I always felt as I was growing up that maybe a little bit of the story was missing, and what I had done was sort of filling those parts of the story, which is actually quite moving, actually. Many people find themselves surprised at the location and accessibility. We had one student at Staff College several years ago who hadn't realised that a battle had been fought on his farm. He grew up on a farm. He knew that something had happened there. There might have been something during the New Zealand Wars, but didn't realise there was an engagement, an ambush had been fought literally on his farm. Okay. It can be sobering and challenging for some, and I talked a moment ago about that sense of shame. Some people do find it challenging, and again, it's a way of talking through it and helping trying to get people to understand and talk about their feelings. I think people, certainly the feedback we get is that, that people, the people who come on our course seem to accept that we do what we can to provide as balanced an account as we can. There's a sense that these wars are as important to us as our Gallipolese and our Greases and Creeks and North Africans and that sort of thing, and our Vietnams and Korea, etc. So there's actually a sense of, pride's probably the wrong term, but a sense that actually we've got something that is uniquely our own. This is something that we don't necessarily share with the rest of the world. We're at Gallipoli, it's over half a dozen other countries. Now, this is something that is uniquely our own, and we need to hang on to it. And finally, I think it's now seen as a relevant and appropriate part of our professional military development continuum. Yeah, so we don't have to, justify what we do anymore. Senior people approach us and ask for help with dealing with a particular training need.